Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm talking to Mike Gouldhawke, a writer and monitor of social issues. He's written for such magazines as Briar Patch and um, Vancouver Media Co-op and Red Wire. My interest in your work actually is kind of strange in that I actually came to you for Marxiological reasons and only realized you were doing Indigenous stuff later. So
Yeah, that's kind of the weird thing because sometimes people assume that all I write about is Marx stuff when actually that's like hardly almost everything I've written has nothing to do with Marx or Marxology.
right.
Hardly like
So
99.9% of the things I've written that had nothing to do with Marx or Marxology.
yeah, I was actually when I talked to you about your work and having you on the show, and I was going through your articles, and I was like, oh, he's written like 3 articles on Marxology and like 27 on Indigenous stuff. I should probably talk to him about Indigenous issues. um, so I went to the article that actually overlapped with both.
Right.
Which is land as a social relation, although like it actually is not really that much Marxology there. It's just kind of the framework that which you're applying. And what I found interesting about that article, just from an outsider's perspective, when I've dealt with a lot of land back radical writers in the United States, particularly around 2020, there was an outright hostility to Marxism in a lot of them.
Right.
Some of this comes from Vine Deloria, and I got a fair amount of Vine Deloria quoted at me, and so some of the more sophisticated critiques of Marxism that I really wrestled with were from people who were pulling from the author of White Mask, Red Faces, and the Uses of Vernon in the Indigenous community, which I think is a pretty substantive critique actually. But you did not frame the issue as something foreign to Marxism or as Marxism's framework as a totally Eurocentric discourse. Why, how did you find Marx useful for dealing with and expressing Indigenous issues?
Yeah, well, I'd say first off, there's a huge difference between the Indigenous resistance movement in Canada and the United States because in Canada, some of the main thinkers and people involved in the Indigenous resistance movement were Marxists. Actually, some of like the most prominent thinkers who kind of influenced everyone else that was involved in the Indigenous resistance movement were Marxists, like Howard Adams and Lee Maracle, for example. But even before them, like the generation before them, there was Jim Brady and Malcolm Norris, who were two Métis Marxists who were actually involved in securing like a land base for Métis communities in Alberta, in the province of Alberta. And then they kind of inspired the next generation, Howard Adams and Maria Campbell. So I think that's kind of starting from a different place. And I think that leads into the book you mentioned with Glenn Coulthard, the Dene writer, Glenn Coulthard's book. It's Red Skin, White Masks. And I think my article was, I didn't directly cite him in that or reference him in there, but I was kind of influenced by his writing, I think, indirectly. And it's kind of just a general concept in the Indigenous movement. It's kind of ironic because it overlaps with Marxist thing of capital is not a thing, but it's a relationship between people that's mediated through things. And then for Indigenous people, the concept is that land is not a thing. It's a social relationship that's mediated through things and through other life forms and other people, social relationships as well as material relationships. And so that's what the kind of land is, the article is, land is a social relationship. But it's also ironic that you mentioned like Vine Deloria Jr., because that's partly where who Glenn Coulthard cites in his book, Red Skin, White Mask. He cites Vine Deloria Jr. for this concept of land and place as being a social relationship, or as sort of being the groundwork for social relationships. And that's kind of a shame because I don't think Vine Deloria Jr. actually read Marx, and he has that article in that book. It's like kind of a terrible book, Marxism and Native Americans by Ward Churchill edited the book. And then Vine Delory Jr. has an article in there, but it's basically he read somebody who had read like Herbert Marcuse or something like this, and he writes an article that's like a critique of Marxism, but it's like he didn't. I don't think he read Marx. I think he was just reading this other guy who was reading Marcuse or whatever. And so it's kind of an unfortunate or distorted thing, because I think I'm really like influenced by Vine Delory Jr.'s thinking and as far as like indigenous resistance and stuff, but it's kind of it's kind of like a missed opportunity. I feel almost like he would have been more sympathetic to Marxism if he actually kind of looked into it more or something, because he's a really intelligent, thoughtful guy, and there's some like overlaps, I think, that are kind of people aren't seeing.
I sometimes think the people not seeing it is somewhat like purposeful, but that's an American thing. I think, so much of the indigenous movement here had to move away from being seen as that kind of red.
I feel like it must have something to do with like American anti-communism. Whereas it's not as strong as in Canada. I think there's like a combination of different reasons, but I think that must be one of it. Why it's not as strong as Canada, because Canada's always had sort of arm's length relationships with like Cuba, China, things like this. So there's not such a sort of virulent anti-communism here like there is in the States. And then we also have this history of not everybody in the like up here too. Not everybody in the indigenous movement, they don't really care. It's kind of ironic. Like they'd be really into Howard Adams or Lee Markle or something, but they don't necessarily care that they're Marxists. It doesn't mean that they're consider themselves Marxists or they take that up themselves. So it's kind of a dynamic thing.
That book, I haven't thought about that book in many, many years, that World Church Here book, because I read it and I was like, I feel like I don't want to sound like the asshole white guy, but I feel like I don't even recognize what they're critiquing a lot of the time. Or I do recognize it in like official state communism, but by the time that book was released, that wasn't even a thing anymore. I mean, so it's odd. I feel like a lot of outside of indigenous activism, a lot of that time period of the early aughts, late 90s, and the way indigeneity was framed in the alter globalization movement, it's just kind of been forgotten by everybody else. Like, which I think often happens with indigenous scholarship, is like we care for a little while and then move on. I definitely feel that with the pipeline battles in the United States, and we have some major lawsuits that are going to be going to the Supreme Court that could really affect things like reclassifying indigenous peoples as a racial category, which at first does not sound not progressive until you realize that it means that almost all sovereign treaty stuff would become illegal off of anti-discrimination law if that was to happen. And I know the Canadian situation is quite different, and I think one of the things I've been following, for people who don't know, my father was a dual citizen of the U.S. and Canada. I mostly have spent my life in the States, but I've kind of been, on the kick with, right liberals and leftists who idolize Canada, like find every bad spot. It's like, no, it's better than here, but and indigenous rights issues are one of them, where in some ways Canada is legitimately better, but in other ways, I mean, you could just look at like some of the statistics, for example, on like life expectancy are actually kind of shocking.
That's kind of like a misconception too. Like, I guess as far as overt like political violence, sometimes Canada is not as bad as the States relatively, but then like you were just mentioning, I think the lawsuit around ICWA, like the Indian Child Welfare Act in the States, and that's a good example where in the 70s, probably partly as a result of the reoccupation of Wounded Knee and all these different occupations that were happening at the time, then you brought in all these laws, which Canada just a couple of years ago, we finally got like Canada's equivalent of ICWA, and that's like more than 40 years later. So that would probably be kind of shocking to most Americans, where they think that Canada is more progressive than the United States. But in some aspects, we're way behind the United States, and tribes in the States actually have more legal sovereignty in certain ways than bands or nations do up here in Canada. Yeah. So it's kind of it's dynamic. It's not like just a straightforward thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison. I think people in America have finally come around to this point of view because of the news about the mass graves at residential schools, which you would expect here and no one expected from Canada. And I was like, well, why not? Like, residential schools are residential schools. They were kind of all operated the same way, and most of the former Anglo colonies, like, they have a couple of models that they pull from.
Again, every country that has settler colonialism.
Yeah. And I have been, more than Canada, I've been active with Indigenous issues in Mexico because I lived there for a few years. You have an even more wide variety, and in some ways an even more antagonistic relationship with the state than people realize. I think there's some knowledge of it because of Chiapas and Zapatistas taking a particular indigenous interest, but it like I was dealing with Mayan co-ops around Ekbalam, having to deal with the fact the government wouldn't put facilities near tourist sites so they could kind of cut their funding and stuff like that. And it's been interesting to watch. And so I consider like understanding the settler colonial problem as a problem of the Americas as being kind of an important thing. So let's talk about the basic argument of your article, though. So land as a social relation, what do we mean by that? How is land analogous to money as a representation? And is there anything particularly to North American indigenous peoples that makes this different than the way we might think of it in, say, pre-modern European relations?
Well, I think that's kind of was the other inspiration behind the article, was that the slogan "land back," it came from memes, and it's just a straightforward thing like land back. It's kind of lends itself to be open to interpretation or people going off in different directions to it, even though it seems really direct. It's just like land reclamation, direct action. To people like me, that's what it seemed like. But but the thing was that when people just say that, or there'd be kind of like there's sort of like a growing kind of reformist thing in Canada where people are like, well, I felt like people are trying to water down land back to a certain extent and have it just be like private property within the colonial and capitalist system of Canada. And I felt like that wasn't really what the spirit of it originally was, or what the Indigenous resistance movement was about. And so I was kind of questioning this concept of land as just like a parcel of private property that could then be returned. And I was talking about more in the sense of territory, like political territory and sovereignty of Indigenous nations, which involves all these different social relationships of people to each other. And it's not just a physical space of, this specific parcel of land, but it's kind of like a wider social relations between people, and a different concept of how do people hold the land. Like sometimes the people use the concept of land tenure instead of ownership or possession or something, because it's more denoting like how do you hold the land, or what are you doing with the land, not just who owns it. One person owns it or somebody else owns it. It's sort of trying to get beyond the Western. Well, like in Canada, they have a very like a straight up political system and legal system that's based on like it's called the Torrens system, and parceling out land in these square parcels. And it's also really like settlement was based on this Lockean concept of the settler would work this land and then it would become his own personal property. But they kind of extended, it wasn't just for white people necessarily. They were trying to extend this concept to Indigenous people too. They're trying to get individual Indigenous people to sort of buy into this and separate from their nations, and even take up the land and work it and own it as private property in certain cases. It's kind of part of their like assimilation program as well. So I kind of wanted to get into that, and then also the concept with I mentioned in my article with Metis people, there is a separate system called script system. It's kind of like allotment in the United States with some of the nations down there, where they're acknowledging Indigenous land title in a certain sense, but they're also trying to parcel it out convert it into individual private property and disperse it. And then it ended up being this huge fraud, because a lot of Métis people, they didn't have any resources. It was more beneficial to them to sell their rights to a parcel of land to a white settler than to keep it as land. And a lot of times the land they're going to be given it's not the best land to begin with. So it's more beneficial actually to sell it. So it's kind of set up by the Canadian government to be, it seems like they're giving us our land back, but actually the way that they're doing it is actually dispossessing us of our land.
Yeah, I was reading the allotment stories of some of the Indigenous peoples in what is now Washington State, and then looking at what was used to compel labor in Rhodesia. And realizing there was weird similarities to the allotment stuff for example, in Rhodesian trade, there was a barring from communal land and a barring for an inheritance, but an allowance for you to own land at like actually really marked up insane debt prices that also favored settlers and whites, even more than other settlers, and English whites even more than other whites. So but there was this entire setup by Cecil Rhodes that did this as a kind of labor capture regime, because it was to force people into the labor pool. Right. And what I find interesting is that wasn't totally what was being done in the northwestern United States, but it actually looks very similar in that it was trying to force people into like bourgeois developmentalism, basically, like in very tiny parcels, which also in almost all cases were sold to settlers because immediate liquidity was probably more important than the title of fairly unproductive land. And this is not very well understood by white people in the U.S. or by most non-Indigenous in the U.S. how this exactly worked. So some of these things actually, when you hear about them compared to like the Trail of Tears, they sound very benign. And then you have to ask, well, then why aren't there Indigenous people on these lands now if we allotted them to them? And it's pretty clearly it was a forced change of the nature of the relationship. Right. Interestingly, also, you see similar things in the settlements of much earlier, like 200 years earlier, in the settlements of Scotland and Ireland, where a lot of this was actually probably tried out first to force people into capitalist relations from, like, I hate the word feudal because it's overused, but European semi-feudal relations,
Yeah. Here in Canada, even like in the late 1800s or early 1900s, whenever the second Boer War was in South Africa, they would send like white soldiers from here or there to fight for England. And then when they came back, they would be rewarded with a parcel of native land as like an allotted parcel of native land here. So it was kind of this interaction between colonialism in South Africa and colonialism in Canada. And then also there's like this British general Middleton who went to war against Métis and Cree people in the 1800s. And then after that, he went to New Zealand and went to war against Maori people there. So at that time, there was like all these interactions between it's the same colonial force of England, but
it's the transatlantic English heritage is strong. I mean, it's you see, like, I think the big irony is it's like looking at the Irish in the United States or the Scottish in Canada and how they're used to like depossess locals, but they are themselves being dispossessed in their native countries and sent to fight over in Africa or in are in Oceania and then shipped over to Nova Scotia. It's just, it's kind of wild. So,
Yeah.
A very elaborate system of taking one group that you were settling and turning them into settlers somewhere else. So you have this constant churn. I'm actually surprised, and maybe you know this better, because I'm actually surprised and never really attempted this with North American Indigenous peoples, like to play one group off of another by resettlement. I guess maybe that was part of the point in the U.S., but I've never seen that stated directly.
Yeah, well, that is something the Canadian government wanted to do with Métis people in Canada. Actually, they before the resistance or uprising in what's now Winnipeg in 1869 to 1870. Before that, like Canada was a brand new country at that time, but they kind of had the Canadian government officials. They would talk about it, and they had kind of this idea that they would use Métis people as a force against other Indigenous people. But then, ironically, then it went the other way at first, because there was the dispute over land and this uprising in 1869, 1870, and then another one in 1885 in Saskatchewan. But they had the concept that even they would use Métis people as a police force, even, and like integrate Métis people into what became the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't really happen at first. Much later now that's kind of happening. But one thing they did get to do was to get Métis people involved in sort of as government officials and getting them involved in the treaty process on the prairies in Canada, and sort of getting them to set up these treaties, which from the First Nations perspective wasn't supposed to be like a land surrender deal, but from the Canadian perspective, that was the point of it, and was to get the Indigenous people to cede the land and kind of grant legitimacy to the Canadian state. But it was kind of it was obviously like a double-handed, or a double dealing thing, because they would say one thing in the treaty meeting, and then the written version later that got printed would say something different than what was actually negotiated.
Yeah, never trust people who don't give you the contract language in your own language. No. But yeah, wow. Why were the Métis in particular used that way? I have as a Yank, I know enough about Canadian history to know that the Métis were often treated differently than the other Indigenous groups, but also as a Yank, I don't know enough to know why. So
yeah, it's a very particular history, because like the formation of the Métis Nation was this really kind of particular historical and place-based development that could only really happen under certain conditions. And basically there's basically that area around the greater area around Winnipeg was initially controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. It wasn't sort of really directly strong, or like controlled by a strong state force. The Hudson's Bay Company was kind of like easily defeated. There's kind of like coexistence between the Métis Nation and the Hudson's Bay Company, but also the Métis Nation could sort of overpower the company at certain points. And Métis people were like the majority of the population in that area, so they were kind of like, they talk about ethnogenesis, but a people isn't necessarily going to continue. Even if a new people form, they're not necessarily going to continue in time, because they may be assimilated into one culture or another. But Métis people were actually able to sort of build a power base there, and that's why there's sort of like longevity, and why this new ethnogenesis of a new people was able to exist. But at the same time, the Canadian government has these like racialist, obviously very racialist ideas that Métis people are half white. So therefore, they're sort of in between both worlds. They're kind of going to be more like sympathetic to the colonialist regime or something. Like it's from our perspective, obviously, it's really kind of bizarre. But at that time, they were like, they figured that Métis people would be more less resistant than First Nations people, and more wanting to collaborate with the Canadian state, and more wanting to oppress First Nations people. And now actually, hundreds of years later, that unfortunately is starting to be the case. But at that time, it was kind of a misconception or a partial misconception, I would say, at the time of how easy it would, like, the Canadian government just was like, oh, they're like they're half white, so they'll be easy to sort of like integrate into our system. That was kind of their racialist they're halfway there already to being white or something. Yeah.
So I actually don't know this about Canadian law. Do you use blood quotient in the same way that we do down here?
No, it's a different system actually. Like it doesn't officially use blood quantum at all. But yeah, they separate Indigenous people into 3 different groups, which is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And they do have a quotient system, but it's a political quotient. So if you marry a non-First Nations person, the next generation will have like a lesser status. And then if those children, when they get older and if they marry a non-Indigenous person, then their children can lose their status. It's kind of the system they set up. So it's similar to, it serves the same
like
purpose.
Latin American caste systems?
Kind of, yeah. It kind of serves the same purpose as blood quantum, which is to like eventually phase out, reserves and just Indigenous peoples as peoples. But it's set up in a different way. But the problem is, the thing that makes it a little more insidious in Canada is that, like I said, Métis people and Inuit people are also Indigenous. But if a First Nations person marries a Métis person or an Inuit person, Métis and Inuit people don't have First Nation status or Indian status, as they call it. So it's the same thing as legally, it's the same thing as if a First Nation person married a white person. Your children are still going to lose status, even though both of their parents are Indigenous, or will have a lesser status, or their next generations will have potential to lose their status.
That actually sounds worse than
yeah, because because the way it works out, after a couple generations, you could have a kid who all of their grandparents are Indigenous, but they don't have status because of this political quotient system, because one of their grandparents was Métis, one was Inuit, one was First Nations, another was First Nations. So it's kind of like a more insidious way to phase out. The government wants to phase out their responsibility, because they have a certain political responsibility to Indigenous people, and then they have different responsibilities to First Nations people than they do to Métis and Inuit people. So they want to phase it out and just assimilate everyone, so everyone is the same. Everyone's just a citizen, a Canadian citizen, with no different status at all.
That is more complicated. I mean,
and in the States, every tribe has their own rules, right? Like some tribes will have blood quantum, some won't. Whereas in Canada, it's more federal across the board as far as status. In individual cases, or individual bands can sometimes like opt out of the status, but it's a little bit more, I would say, homogenized, like federally across the country than it is in the States, where each tribe gets to have its own rules to a certain extent.
Yeah. Tribes can adopt groups in and can. I think blood quantum is used as a default, but tribes can bypass it, or they have their own rules, and they can establish, I think, the stringency of blood quantum depending on what trying to understand United States Indigenous law actually does kind of blow my mind sometimes, because you're dealing with every Indigenous person is technically a U.S. citizen now. That happened in the early 20th century, but they are quasi-sovereign nations, sort of, but not really, because it takes an act of Congress to fix a pothole, and I'm not even joking about that. So it's just it actually seems like a perfect legal nightmare in a lot of ways. But from what I've gathered looking at Canada is it's not a lot better. It's just different. Another difference we talked about is that the Indigenous peoples, because of the Indian Wars, because of the Trail of Tears and the resettlement, in the United States are kind of concentrated in the Mountain West and in the Southwest. So there's not that many, say, urban reserves or East Coast reserves. There are a few. It's not that there's none, but I think the great majority of reserves are actually literally in the state of Oklahoma. So, and that means also that most of the Indigenous population is rural and kind of acts and votes along rural voting patterns. That's not true in Canada. As you were telling me, actually, I was not aware of like the settlement patterns in Canada. So how does that work exactly? There's a lot more, but smaller recognized areas.
Yeah, it's different in different provinces and different parts of Canada. Like in British Columbia, there's more reserves and also smaller reserves. And there's more, part of that is because there was more Indigenous, different nations here before colonization as well. And maybe communities were smaller as well. And then in other provinces, like in Alberta and in Ontario, there can be much larger reserves that are kind of similar to the United States in some ways. But I'd say in general, yeah, the difference is that there's all across Canada, there are Indigenous communities, and there was displacement where they would remove a reserve and put it somewhere else. But it wasn't like in the States where there was the Trail of Tears and people were moved from, the East Coast into Oklahoma. That's not really the case of what happened in Canada. It was more local displacement. Like in Winnipeg, there used to be a reserve right in the north part of Winnipeg where my family used to live like more than 100 years ago. And then they removed that reserve to another part of the province, but not into a different province, but into another part of the province. But the idea was they didn't want certain reserves to be right in the city or right next to the city. But there are still a lot of urban reserves in Canada as well. Like, especially here in Vancouver, there's a lot of reserves here in the greater Vancouver area. And in Washington State, actually, in the United States, it's more similar like that. There's one in the middle of Tacoma, and there's some around Olympia and whatnot.
Right.
So, in general, I'd say that's a big difference between Canada and the States. And part of the difference, I'd say, is that the settler population up here is a little bit more, even if it's not positive, they're more conscious of Native people's existence and the fact that there is like in some cases, they're more conscious of the fact that there's an Indigenous resistance movement. And a lot of the movements here started in urban areas too. Like here in Vancouver, there was a group called Native Alliance for Red Power that started before the American Indian movement in the States. They started here in '67. And I think part of that is due, like I was saying, there's a lot of urban reserves here. And also a lot of people from all over the province will kind of move to the city, to Vancouver, or even from other provinces and stuff too. So, and then out east, like in Quebec, for example, there's a reserve right next to Montreal called Gouldhawke. It's like a Mohawk reserve, and that's kind of like a real, always been kind of like a hotbed of Indigenous resistance as well. And that's right next to the city. And on the one hand, that's positive, but then on the other, in 1990, when there was blockades and stuff, there was actually white people were rioting. They were rioting against the police, complaining that the police weren't cracking down on the Mohawk blockades. So, and that's kind of a common occurrence too, actually. Anytime there's any kind of Indigenous resistance in different parts of Canada, a lot of times white people will riot and actually destroy Native people's like fishing equipment and things like that. Yeah. So there's like, on the one hand, there's more solidarity from white people, I would say, in Canada than in the States. But on the other hand, there's also can be more anti or like resistance to Indigenous resistance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. Anti-Indigenous sentiment in the United States is often very, very regional. But a lot of places where there isn't a lot of anti-Indigenous sentiment, there also just aren't a lot of Indigenous people at all. Like, for example, in the South, like there was not a lot of anti-Indigenous sentiment when I lived there. And it's interesting to go back actually and look at the weird history of this. For example, like not to say much good about the Confederacy as a person who grew up in Georgia, but the Confederate laws actually were better to Indigenous people than the Union laws were. They probably wouldn't have stayed that way. There was, and when you go back and read like writings from the 19th century from different, white intellectuals, you find people are either pro-black or pro-Indigenous, but they're never both, which is very, very weird to go. Like, I don't have a good explanation for it. I've just historically, like, I've seen it. I've seen people talk about it. And so, like, one of the interesting things out here is there's a lot of anti-Indigenous sentiment that is not, that people don't view as racism, and I am often like shocked by it because I'm not from the West. But when I recapitulate it in like okay, but this is similar to what I saw with Black people or with Latin people in the East Coast, it makes a little bit more sense. But the nature of it is different, and I think like that is a complication that Canada doesn't have, because I think the racial laws and racial discourse in the United States actually puts Indigenous people in kind of an interesting bind, because the racial categories are being imposed on them from outside. Obviously, it's not like that's a natural Indigenous concept, but usually something that would help on one category will hurt in the other.
Right.
And there's not the same tension in Canada, is there? Well,
it's different, definitely. I think it's probably more tension in the States, or more the state purposely trying to play different groups against each other. But Canada has somewhat different demographics, and it's also different in different parts of Canada, and different provinces and different cities have different demographics or different groups of people. Sometimes there is tension between other non-white groups of non-white people and Indigenous people, and then sometimes there is people trying to build solidarity between them and between the struggles. Yeah, like between like Palestinian people and South Asian people. Sometimes there's and Indigenous people. There's sometimes people trying to build solidarities, or with Black people in the not so much in Vancouver, but, or I guess I shouldn't say that either, but also a lot of people are both. A lot of people are Black and Indigenous, or Indigenous and of Asian ancestry as well too. So I think it really depends on the location, but I don't know if Canada tries to play that up as much. Yeah, there's more tension between white Canadians and Indigenous people in Canada, I'd say.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about something that's similar. Do you know about the Malungan category in the Southeast
I heard a little bit
States?
about it. Yeah.
Which is a triracial category, so it's mixed African, white, and Indigenous. I think mostly Muskogee and I don't know, Blackfoot peoples. I'm not sure though. What basically happened is all those people got turned white over time, and it was interesting because it was progressive from the standpoint of Jim Crow laws. So this is one of these things where I don't even think this was explicit policy. It was just a weird side effect. So if we now view these people who pass as white, who are triracial in origin, as white people, they're no longer subject to Jim Crow laws in the 1950s, but they're also now completely cut off from any notion of a relationship to indigeneity, and they're the nations in which they partially come from, and so that identity has been kind of totally assimilated, completely. To get one of the reasons why I was really attracted though to your land as a social relation, because decolonization and Marxism are things that people think go together hand in hand, but even I have to admit that it's actually kind of hard to always pair them, because particularly if your notion of decolonization is local nationalism, as has been the model kind of imposed on everybody from the European national question, as understood by Marxist groups in the 19th century and early 20th century. What I find interesting is that, that's a big, I've read all the debates in Africa about this, between Chinua Achebe and more, different tribal decolonizers who want to drop the notion of nation, want to drop unifying languages, etc. And I've always wondered about that tension in the North American indigenous groups because, and I think the book that we mentioned, Red Faces, White Masks, does actually go into this somewhat, because a lot of the kind of concessions given to indigenous groups in Canada actually does belabor you accepting the legitimacy of a lot of bourgeois, nationalist concepts and legality that, I mean, just in practical purposes, it's not necessarily in any one nation's interest to accept. For example, I mean, most of the indigenous people in the border area between Canada and the United States, their historical lands are in both countries.
Yeah.
Or you take people like the Dine who have historical lands throughout a large swath of Mexico all the way up to southern Canada. I mean, why do you think viewing land as a social concept that needs to be reconsidered may be a way out of that problem?
Well, I'd say it's complex because to start with, I'd say Fanon was a huge influence on the Indigenous resistance movement in Canada in particular, and probably in the States as well. But the thing is that when people started reading Fanon up here in the late 60s, early 70s, they kind of realized that Canada is not like Algeria, because there's not a one unified colonized nation that is fighting against the colonizer nation. Like in Algeria, it would be France, right? In here, we'd be fighting against Canada. But there's hundreds, a couple hundred nations across Canada almost. And so even some of the native, particularly native Marxists like Howard Adams and Ray Bob, they were actually proposing that all indigenous nations should sort of consider themselves as one nation rather than as individual or independent nations. And the other problem is that we're this tiny minority of the population here, 5% of the population, or probably even less in the 60s. So it makes the decolonization struggle, or the national question, more complex too, because you're going to have to form alliances with other groups of people in order to decolonize and to liberate your territory. But then the other side of it was there was before colonization, there was confederacies of different indigenous nations that would ally with each other, and there still are, especially out east with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and they're still really strong, and they still have a really strong sense of sovereignty, and not considering themselves Canadian or American citizens, and their territories on both sides of the border as well. And same with the Métis Nation, actually, too. There was Métis communities in the States right along the border, but the United States government doesn't recognize them. They forced them to join a Anishinaabe community, like a Turtle Mountain or something like this, or communities in Montana. Because the United States didn't want to recognize Métis people, I guess, as a separate category. But as far as land being land as a social relationship being a way out of it, well, there were other people, in the land back issue of Briar Patch that I wrote the thing for. There were other articles where people are talking about this concept of alliances between different nations, because there's already relationships between, say, the Métis Nation and the Cree Nation and Anishinaabe Nation. And so I think it wasn't really spelled out explicitly, but there is sort of a concept of rebuilding these confederacies and having that be part of decolonization as well. And that was something proposed by, there's a writer from the Mohawk Nation out east who kind of proposed that too. It's kind of funny because he was proposing that all the other nations just join the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So on the one hand, it's actually a really good idea, but then it's also kind of funny because we would all be joining their confederacy rather than forming a new confederacy that was sort of equal to everyone or whatever. But that was another way to resolve the problem. Instead of because Howard Adams and Ray Bob's like proposal of just forming one indigenous nation, in the 60s it kind of made sense because there was like a revival of native culture and there was more of sort of like pan-indigenous crossover and concepts being put out there. But then after that it became more individually nationalistic, and people were trying to specifically reclaim like their specific language and specific culture and things. So this concept of having one indigenous nation, it really lost any potential kind of momentum that it would have had, I would say. But
right. It seems for different reasons than say Pan-Asianism or Pan-Africanism did. But yeah, like
I think it's due to the way that the cultures were before colonialism, in part. I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's due to these confederacies. Some of the aside from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and maybe the Blackfoot Confederacy, like there was a confederacy that Métis and Cree people and Anishinaabe people were part of called the Iron Confederacy, but that kind of fell apart during like the earlier stage of colonization. But I'm not sure if I'm like really answering like your question that much as far as like the Marxist sort of take on national liberation or something. That seems like that was more what you're asking, and I'm not sure if my answer really helps with that or not. Yeah.
It points out the complications of trying to do the national question as an answer to a lot of these settler issues, because it's a problem in Africa. I mean, we've seen nations being built in Africa, and we've also seen how, former settler governments just did it willy-nilly. They made sure there was interethnic rivalries, which made the nations not particularly viable. You can really see that in places like Rwanda and the Congo, and in North America and South America, land back would never entirely mean that anyway. I mean, in some ways you do have to answer like, well, you have all these Europeans who've been here for 500 years and they don't have anywhere to go back to. So how do you incorporate land sovereignty, recognize what happened beyond, land acknowledgement? I'm glad that I'm not the only person who finds that's funny. But there's a real sense of a political problem that the classic Marxist nationalist answer for Europe and maybe the Middle East isn't a clear answer to, because when you start thinking about like, what are the criterions for nations in the European category? What's language? And like there's more languages probably spoken than there even are officially recognized nations and bands. So it's just like, well, that's not viable. What do we do here?
I'd say there were different proposed solutions to that. Like Vine Deloria Jr. wrote about that actually in I think it was 1974 in Behind the Trail Broken Treaties, and he has an article in there that's called "The Size and Status of Nations." And he's basically arguing like the Navajo Nation in the States, for example, is larger than a lot of European nation
Absolutely.
states.
Yes.
So he's saying, and a lot of these nation states in Europe and stuff, they're landlocked as well. He's basically saying there's no real political reason why the Navajo Nation couldn't be its own nation state, is basically what he's arguing. And it's actually his argument's pretty convincing, actually, that it's just a question of politics or whatever. But then in Canada, like I said, when people started reading Fanon, they were analyzing it, and they're saying like, well, the problem is in Canada, it's not going to be like in Wretched of the Earth, because Indigenous people are such a small percentage of the population, and there's not the same kind of consciousness. It was sort of developing at that time in the 60s and 70s. This like revolutionary nationalist consciousness was developing. And Howard Adams is Métis Marxist writer. He actually wrote a lot about this concept of there being like revolutionary nationalism and then sort of reactionary or cultural nationalism, which the Canadian state would actually promote as an alternative to revolutionary nationalism. And he's talking about how he was kind of influenced by Nkrumah and Fanon and a lot of African revolutionary writers. And he was saying that, the Canadian state is promoting cultural nationalism among Indigenous people, but a sort of depoliticized nationalism, or a capitalist nationalism in a way, you know, and it's sort of like this caricature of indigenous culture, or sort of like a hollowed out version of it. But in reality, indigenous culture and spirituality would have to be connected to the land and reclaiming the land, and not just sort of government funded programs by the government of Canada to display indigenous culture to the world and show that they're multicultural or something like this. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, I used to make a Marxist argument about how there's no such thing as multiculturalism, because anytime you had a culture that actually had any significant pull on the means of production in relation to property, that won't be allowed. And so there's a hard limit, and a kind of superficial limit to any multiculturalism, even not just in America, but even in the United States, but even in the Canadian and Mexican models too, because it's just like, well, no, there's some, some indigenous ways of life are not copacetic to capitalism at all. And even if they were, allowed to develop their own modernity, and coexisted with people here, what do you do? And I think a lot about that, because I think about the story, and again, I'm going to where I'm more comfortable, which is Black struggles in the South, because I know those better. Yeah. But I think about Harry Cruz and the weird relationship of Black cultural nationalism as a pretext for Black political nationalism, and how that was even encouraged. I mean, it looks like Cruz may have gotten some funding from the OSS and CIA, for example, once he left the CPUSA. Whereas Black radical nationalism, or political nationalism, was highly discouraged. But there's also just the kind of fact that even when, say, the Black Panther Party had something like 60% support in the Black community in the United States in the 60s, most Black people were not separatist, nationalists of any variety. Even if they were sympathetic to semi-nationalist groups. The Panthers are actually interesting on whether or not they were political nationalists at all, but different factions within the Panthers were, and different factions weren't. But I find that kind of interesting when I went back and looked at the CPUSA. I always thought the Black Belt thesis was part of why it was popular amongst Black people, and it wasn't. Actually, the Black Belt people was largely never completely accepted. So yeah. It's an interesting thing. That would not be true for Indigenous people, though, and I think there's material reasons why, and the land gets to the whole concept of well, it's one thing to be removed from your from where your culture and way of life developed and been placed somewhere else. It's another thing to have it plowed over. And the creation of whiteness and European identity is frankly a successfully having already done that in Europe. And how that happens is different, but it is interesting to me when you try to figure out how to build solidarity between, say, poor white people and Indigenous people. A lot of poor white people don't think they have hostility to Indigenous people unless they're in the West, in the United States, which is interesting. They do, but they're not aware of it.
They don't think of it.
It just doesn't occur to them. But the thing that's always interesting to me is well, there's a way in which the Scotch Irish thing about gets overplayed, the idea that they were not white. Well, no, they weren't. But then again, whiteness wasn't really a category the way we think of it now. And in some ways, as soon as they were able to become right, they became even more reactionary than the WASP were. But there is a sense that if you look at the plural nationalism of the British Isles, that it was also clearly the first, the first modern settler colonial project within the British Isles itself. And so that's it's interesting to try to like build a conceptual bridge there, but I find that it doesn't really work because you get back into identity grievances.
Well, I see a lot of like kind of paranoia on the internet, I guess, of people thinking that indigenous nationalism is like this ethno nationalism that's going to create an ethno state or something. But I feel like they're sort of juxtaposing or projecting their own concepts of other kinds of nationalism onto indigenous nationalism, and I feel like it's kind of a different concept. And a lot of indigenous nations here in Canada, anyway, before colonization, didn't have a state. They would have a political confederacies, or even like Engels, he wrote about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and he said they have a public constitution, they have an army essentially, but they don't have a state because there's not a class. The only reason he said is because there's not a class division.
Right, there's not
between the army and the people. It's the same. It's all the same people.
Effectively, it's a functional militia, right?
Like, yeah, and it's part of the whole political. There's a complex and public political organization, but everyone's involved in it. There's not a class division. So other people would say that's a state. Like a lot of Haudenosaunee people would say it is a state in their own concept. It's the equivalent of a European state or something. But it's kind of interesting that Engels said, well, no, actually it's not, because there's no class divisions. There were certain gender divisions or other kinds of divisions, or maybe not divisions, but different roles, but it wasn't like a class division where the state was kind of separate from society kind of a thing. So that affects the nationalism up here, I think, where the nationalism isn't necessarily to set up an ethno state that's going to exclude other people. And like I said before, there were confederacies before colonization, but then also indigenous people were like entering into treaties with the concept that they were going to share. We were going to share land with newcomer people, right? It wasn't to be exclusive one way or another, but also we didn't think we're giving up our sovereignty. We figured like the land was still ours, but we had land to share with other people as well. So it wasn't like an exclusive. The way like people kind of have this paranoia about it, that basically indigenous people are going to do the same thing that white people did to indigenous people in the Americas. So I feel like I mean, there are problems with just like now, because nationalism is like an ideology or whatever that's developed over the last couple hundred years, so there is certain like bleed over or sort of people picking up like negative aspects of it, but I think it's more complex than the way people portray it, or the way non-native people portray it.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like, just putting my logical philosopher brain on, I think of it as an equivocation problem with words, where I'm like, well, we don't have another word for what we're talking about here. We're talking about like indigenous governments and self-autonomy in coexistence with, people who are already here. No one is expecting massive ethnic cleansing. But the problem that you have, I mean, like the problem that I have with the national question is everyone's framework for it, even leftist framework for it, is essentially European. Like the national discourse is Eurocentric. Like even when you talk about the United States, because they're like, it's a nation state. I'm like, no, it's not. Like, we're not actually a nation state. What do you mean? We've never been one ethnic group. White is not an ethnic group. Like, it's a new category.
It's constructed, yeah. It's all socially constructed, yeah.
It's a new. I mean, ethnic groups are socially constructed too, but like white is an explicitly socially constructed category, so that we didn't have ethnic groups anymore. So like, it can become more porous than like who's English or not, because the English dominated everything was not a viable economic proposition in settler world, honestly. So that, getting people to realize that these words have become muddled in the 20th century, and it's just too natural use, like is kind of a big deal. But I do think that, for example, Black nationalism has often been portrayed as it would be, maybe not an ethno state entirely, but it would be ethno exclusive or racial exclusive, and it was interesting watching, like, when I tell people, like, but go read what not what African American writers said about this, because yes, they're legitimate and it's in our context, but they're also in a completely post-European, post-transatlantic context. Go read what African writers have, the debates amongst them about how to deal with this, because you realize that it's way more complicated. It's not particularly simple. Decolonization can go a lot of different ways. Unfortunately, a lot of it has gone the nation state way, and then has sadly sometimes degenerated into ethno-nationalism, but there's nothing inherent to autonomy that would necessarily lead it to that, because it wasn't that way for thousands of years beforehand. So like,
and I guess the other problem is that, like, here in North America anyways, it's like the nationalism doesn't necessarily originally maybe had like a critique of capitalism, but it doesn't necessarily anymore.
Yeah,
It's
true.
It kind of plays into what I was saying before with Howard Adams' thing about there being sort of a revolutionary nationalism, and then there being sort of a reactionary cultural nationalism, where it could actually be promoting capitalism as well. And obviously colonialism and capitalism are like distinct systems, but they're also totally interlinked and
Right.
fueling each other at the same time. So a lot of the people in the Indigenous resistance movement in Canada are like critical of capitalism, and I'd say even more so. It's becoming more and more obvious. But then also with the ecological destruction of the world, it's kind of like becomes more necessary, I think, to have a critique of capitalism, and to have, like, if there is going to be some kind of nationalism or national liberation, it has to involve like a critique of capitalism, because there's not even going to be a planet for people. There won't be a planet, let alone a territory to liberate.
Well, yeah. I mean, my big thing right now is like, well, I'm all about autonomy of groups, but I'm also kind of increasing like, but we all realize that all of our nationalisms are going to have to get over real soon, or none of us are going to survive the next 2 centuries. Like, none of us. So, thank you, Stellar Project. You killed us all, even those of us who are the white skin color. So, it's something I think a lot about. I've been thinking about ways to reframe it, because I go back, like, personally, I go back and forth. I really liked your article because it did give me a way to think about this in a way that was like, okay, how do I explain Indigenous nationalism, not in terms of nation states as the primary actor of decolonization, because I do think that's a problem, particularly if you have nation states as the idea of ethno state. I actually like Ingalls. I think what's interesting when you would talk about state, I'm like, well, Ingalls is actually saying that it's a good thing that there's not a state there, because you don't necessarily want classes.
So, like, he was definitely saying it's a positive thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, so we could have all these government functions and not have permanent classes, which are a nation state. I think that's, again, another equivocation, because I think a lot of people think of nation states as like an administrative state. And I'm like, well, does it have permanent roles that you can inherit or not? Like, that, if it doesn't have strong social classes, or social class divisions are not really classes, they're temporary functions. And if it does, it's a class society, and we'll develop a state, etc. And I would say in different indigenous groups would actually historically have different answers on that category scales, what they were before settler colonial periods, but a lot of them would probably have been like governments without states. Not all of them. I mean, some of the societies like the Southeastern United States were definitely semi-monarchical, but like that's
or in other parts of the Americas too, like Mexico or Peru and stuff.
But that's not everybody. So
each nation has its own culture and its own hierarchy or lack of hierarchy.
So I guess just to shift a little bit, and I'm glad we get to talk about this, because I do feel like my listeners have a very well, not all of them, but a lot of them have a very superficial understanding of indigenous issues, and it's something that I've been concerned about after moving to the West and realizing that I had a superficial understanding of indigenous issues. Um, uh, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, though, is you've done a lot. You have done a lot of tweeting about more than actual writing articles, but I do have a Briar Patch article that you've written fairly recently about let me find it. Just looking at it. Oh yeah. About about Marxist categories. So how did you get into Marxology as a person who is also, Marxology is for nerds, like,
Yeah.
and I am that kind of nerd. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
But
that's why it appealed to me, I think.
But it's not something I know that like indigenous activists tend to be that into. So
yeah, no, that's true. I mean, like I said, there were a lot of Marxist, like indigenous resistance people and writers that were into Marxism, but Marxology was not their angle for it. It was more, and that was my introduction to Marx, was not directly through Marx, but it was through like Fanon and Howard Adams and Lee Markle, these indigenous writers who they would mention Marx kind of in passing or in a sort of small chunk of analysis, but it wasn't super like overt. They're sort of not like, they were more writing about indigenous resistance in general, and then they would throw in sort of like a quote or a bit of analysis from Marx or something, but it wasn't sort of like beat you over the head. But it did generate an interest in Marxism for me. And then I was also interested in like started to get interested in like anarchism, as well as like anti-state communist stuff, or kind of like situationist and communization kind of writers and stuff. And then I wanted to find out who influenced them. So I read Lukács, and I was kind of interested in like the socialism or barbarism group and things like Castoriadis and things like that. I was trying to I'm always trying to follow the notes and see who's influencing who. That was always sort of a fascination for me, even like 20 years ago when I started reading that stuff. But then I sort of slowly got into reading Marx himself, and I kind of started with like his pamphlets, like Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit, and then his early writings and stuff. And then I went to Capital and his political writings and things like that. Yeah, so just got kind of more interested in it over time, and interested in like the debates and polemics about it, but also interested in like when I read Wage, Labor, and Capital and Value, Price, and Profit, I was more like, I found it really practical, kind of thinking about like the workplace and people's concepts of basically like wage mystification was kind of my main interest point for Marxism, I would say, and Marxology, was the way that Marx lays out that as workers we don't own the commodities that we're making.
Right.
So like alienation in the sense of actual physical separation, where we own our labor power as a commodity, but we don't own the commodities that we're producing, that those belong to the capitalist.
Right.
That really sparked my interest, the way that he described that, because it's sort of like because I'm not an academic, I just have a regular job and stuff. So a lot of times when you're at work, you think about these things in sort of a superficial way, or you kind of feel it. But then when someone can actually like put it into words and actually describe and sort of analyze and break down how it actually works, and you're like, oh, okay, that's what I was, it gives you another way of thinking about what you were actually experiencing in real life. So that's what got me interested in the Marxology of it.
I'm an ex-academic, but in poetry. So like,
oh, that's better. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. So when it was actually similarly, I was working at when I was actually even kind of a political reactionary, to be honest, in my early 20s. And I was sitting at an insurance job trying to figure out how any of these models of profits and prices and any of that made any sense, because I could see that, well, most of the economy I was dealing with was in rents. I didn't follow anything that Adam Smith wrote about, and he was actually against a lot of that. And then I was modeling out like wage capture and like, well, how, feeling alienated at work. Who even was the capitalist anymore was a big question for me, because you're so removed from the ownership now. That alienation is like compounded and compounded in a way that Marx kind of predicted, actually. And when I think I read like part of the Grundessa, and then the first couple of chapters of Das Kapital, and I was like, no, this makes more sense than anything else that I've dealt with. Then I went through the Marxology debates to try to figure it out, and then then 2007 and 8 happened, and it felt like, oh, I get to like see this in real time. Also, it sucks.
Finding out about Marxism the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. Then Occupy happened, and I remember just like, okay, now I'm reading Andrew Crumman, now I'm reading Michael Heinrich. I was just trying to figure it out. Eventually, I just sort of like trusted my gut on Marx, and I was following the footnotes, actually similar to you. And I also went back and did that with more like official communist stuff later. So I was like, okay, well, who was Stalin citing? Who was Lenin citing? Oh, Lenin made an argument about the state that I'm totally surprised by. This, that, and the other. And also trying to reconcile that. One of the big things I used to try to reconcile about the Soviet Union was like what they did to the land in Azerbaijan, which was a disaster. And then what happened to indigenous groups in what is now the Russian Federation of Siberian Indigenous and whatnot, because they were never recognized as nations and they were not part of the Soviet nation building project. And it's like pretty bad, actually, what happened there.
I mean, it seems like there was a difference in policy between like Lenin's era and Stalin's era, though, too. I feel like Lenin was a little more sympathetic to national self-determination. And then Stalin was more trying to eliminate certain nationalities, like especially in Siberia. I know more about Siberia, but I'm sure there was other things going on elsewhere too.
Yeah, well, there was a massive shift, and there was, the national question of the Soviet Union has like always kind of been a bugaboo, honestly, because you see, not just Stalin, but Khrushchev, Brezhnev, oscillating wildly about how to deal with it, when to encourage it, when to not. Even in the case of I was reading a book about World War II, and even during World War II, the Stalin pivoting back and forth about whether or not the Russians were special and fighting off the Germans. And people in the United States hear that, and they're like, well, they mean the Soviets. Like, no, he's being specific. He means the Russians. But he abandons it like a year later, and
that's why I see people making blanket statements about how the relationship between the USSR and colonialism, but I feel like the policy was changing all the time, so it's kind of hard to
daily.
say that.
It gets more consistent in the 60s, but you also feel like, I feel like at that point, though, they are trying to apply the European national question to everyone, and they're doing it because they don't really have any other grounds of expansion. And I don't mean that like in an imperialist way. Like, they don't have way to get out of there. Like, we need to expand our bloc, but how do we do that? Well, national liberation, but we can't force people to be communists. What are we going to do? And then you start having stuff like the Prague Spring, and then it's like, oh, well, now they want relative democratization within the Soviet bloc. And talking about this one, I'll get people mad at you on the internet, which I will admit is the wildest thing. I did not think I would live to see young people being interested in communism, but then deciding that they were interested in probably the worst parts of it.
It's just like gravitating to the more reactionary aspects.
It's like, we're going to. This is not to say that like all Marxist Leninism is equal. It's not at all. But it's been interesting to see how that's developed. I find Marxology, interestingly, it can become very frustrating academic, but it is a way for you to test, like, okay, what did people think in 1870 this meant, and what did we say it meant in 1920, and what did we say it meant in 1960, and they clearly can't be the same thing. Like,
yeah, it's interesting how it develops over time, because mostly people just think of like Rubin was the only one who was dealing with it at that time in the 20s or whatever. But then Lukács is dealing with like commodity fetishism when other people really weren't. And then I found this old article from 1908 by Anton Pannekoek where he's talking about value theory and stuff. So some of the stuff is just buried in languages that people aren't translating into English, really. So
I feel like it's not like Dutch is hard, but
no. Well, he wrote but he wrote it in German, I guess.
Oh, but that's still not hard.
No, I think people just weren't looking for it. Yeah. So in a way, what value form theory people, I think they say what they say about like worldview Marxism is true to a certain extent, where it just wasn't, most Marxists weren't interested in the early chapters of Capital or whatever. There wasn't as much analysis of it until later. But then there must be like I'm kind of interested in like what are the political reasons? Like why did Rubin develop that analysis? Did it have something to do with his place within the USSR and like what he thought was going on with the USSR, or what are ways of justifying communism or something like this? And then how did it then develop in the the new Marx lecture in the 60s and 70s? Is that a political reaction to something as well, right? Or
well, yeah, that's been for me the most interesting part of that, and that's the part I've gotten in the last 5 years, which is like, okay, from Marx to whoever, let's go into the beginnings of the Third International. What is the context for this? Because I feel like we haven't known it, or we've gotten it through the context of like sectarian and nationalist divisions of the 60s, right, that actually distort what, even the name holders of those divisions like Trotsky and Mao were actually arguing about. Like,
right.
Yeah, Maoism is a fun one to try to understand, because it's like 5 things, and yet like
it's kind of unique, some unique aspects to the theory.
Yeah, well, the picking up of like the of Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, and then making that into like a theoretical apparatus as opposed to a political one, it's kind of unique to Mao. But like there are hints of everything in Maoism, but the thing is, like, it also changes, like trying to figure out like what
over time,
like Maoism means everything from Dingism to like ultra leftism,
right?
To, so like to the left of most left communist, and like in the Cultural Revolution period, you actually have like both things happening simultaneously. Like, I mean, because Mao did actually really establish peasants and workers' councils. Like, that was real. He really temporarily abolished money for a little while.
But then things changed over time.
Very quickly, actually, like in 3 years.
It's kind of
wild.
It kind of reminds me of how, like, here in Vancouver, there were like 2 different Trotskyist groups, and then one was like a real social democratic entryist one, and the other one was like virulently against the Social Democratic Party here, or semi-Social Democratic Party here in BC. So they ostensibly have the same ideology, but they had like very different strategies or kind of approaches to it or whatever.
Yeah. I one time tried to map out all the Trotskyist groups and their positions, and then I mapped out all the Maoist groups and their positions. And then I pointed out that like some of the Maoist groups have more in common with some of the Trotskyist groups than they did with other Maoist groups or other Trotskyist groups. It was it was just like, and I think that's actually kind of what got me into, like, at first it was just trying to understand Marx, but later on it was like, now, this sectarian stuff that I'm learning by proxy as it's kind of dying in the late aughts when I get into this, in my late 20s and early 30s, and I'm like, okay, that stuff in the 60s and 70s was wild. Why did that happen? Yeah. But then I'm like, okay, well, to me, like, going back and looking at value theory, value form theory, and all that was a way to get out of those cul-de-sacs.
Right, yeah.
Just be like, what does the text say? Now, I will say this. I do have a kind of slightly Henrickian stuff where I'm like, well, some stuff, like, I don't read it with the rubric of like, and this is different for me from Lukács, where like you can reconcile all of Marx to all other parts of Marx, because I've just read too many Marx letters to be like, no, he changed his mind. Like,
oh yeah, definitely, yeah. It's funny because Kamat says the opposite. He says like Marx is completely homogenous. Everything is perfect. Everything he said works with everything else, and it's all perfect. He says the exact opposite.
Kind of
ridiculous.
Kamat, like, I kind of was funny because I'm like, well, you know, the Marxist humanists usually have a coherence theory, but then you meet like Bordigist and post-Bordigist like Kamat, and they're just like, no, there's an invariant program and it's perfect. It kind of like Marx discovered it as if it was from the heavens,
right?
And also, the revolution was lost. Nothing good can happen now. We just have to rewild the world, like, which is not what most Borgists argue, but it is what Kamat eventually argued. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, I don't know that basically Pol Potting the entire planet is a great idea.
I think Endnote said something like, "We don't need to follow Kamat into the woods" or something.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time with Endnote. Yeah, that's. But it is interesting. Do you think that form of like? So it's interesting in the United States. It is kind of true that, particularly in the Black political tradition, Marxist-Leninism, and some Marxist is part of Black radicalism, which it kind of isn't. But in so much that it is Marxist-Leninism. It's kind of a holdover from like the way the CPUSA actually organized in the South in the 1930s, because of the absolute prohibition on like what would become the Popular Front. But it also then flips over and like ties during the Popular Front period, it ties Black radicals to the Democratic Party basically forever after that. Right. And I find that interesting because that doesn't seem to have been true even in the U.S. indigenous community. Like when you meet Marxists, they don't tend to be Marxist-Leninists. Occasionally, I've met indigenous academics who have a fascination with Maoism because they equivocate a lot of the pastoral stuff to peasantry, and I'm like, I'm not sure that that's actually the same, but you know, whatever. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. So we do. There's some of that, but it doesn't have the same sort of claims being made. But you know, I do see people like your fellow Canadian Indigenous person, J. Paul Mafwad, who's Mafwad. I can't say his name. I actually never heard it pronounced. Do you know how you pronounce JP?
No, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I know exactly who you're talking about. Though,
yeah. The funny thing is, I'm literally the person at Zero Books who advocated for publishing his books, even though I politically disagree with like half of everything he says.
Yeah, no, it seems like a nice guy though, and you know.
Yeah, he's a nice guy. He's a good scholar, actually.
Yeah.
He's a weird scholar, but he's a good scholar, and I thought his books were interesting enough that I wanted them to be printed by someone so we could debate them. But I've never heard his name said, so I think I've always said it wrong. But do you think like does like Marxist-Leninism have a lot of pull in the Indigenous community? It seems so removed from it from here, but
yeah, no, in Canada, I'd say like for me, I always think of Marxist-Leninists as just like because it's called Stalinism usually.
Yeah.
But the reason is because I would say there were certain Indigenous Marxists here who are really into Lenin, like Jim Brady and Howard Adams. To some extent, they were into Lenin, but I don't think they weren't into Stalin. And then you had Lee Markle, and there were some Indigenous Marxists that were really into Maoism, or initially they were, and then they sort of kind of broadened their horizons to a certain extent or something. But I would say, Marxism-Leninism is not the dominant form of Marxism, either in the non-native sort of scene in Canada or in the native movement. It's more, it used to be Trotskyism, actually. Was, like I said, it was the more dominant tendency. But like I said, it would be split into all these different Trotskyist tendencies of some more social democratic, some more revolutionary or anti social democratic. And that was sort of but that wasn't really big in the indigenous movement. People were more just into Lenin or Marx or Mao or something, yeah. And well, then trying to change it to be more indigenous or something. Yeah.
Well, Mao I kind of understand. I mean, there is such a way. Like, I also kind of see like in the Chinese like multi-nation nationalism model that's not, well, it didn't used to be assimilationist. It's not so much true anymore. I got in trouble one time for pointing out that Sun Yat-sen acknowledged the Tibetan peoples as an independent people within China. Just like, I'm just saying, like,
just saying the facts. You know?
Yeah, just like
it's still getting attacked for it.
Yeah, just like that was in the Kuomintang doctrine when Sun Yat-sen, who was both a communist and a Kuomintang member, was positing the five major peoples and 18 minor peoples theory. Like, also the Western peoples were acknowledged as a people as well. It wasn't just like Korean Chinese, Han Chinese. What's the other one? Cantonese and Toisanese or whatever. Like, it's interesting to point that out. China itself being one of those kind of like the United States, although not settler in anyone's immediate memory. It had to be settler at one point, but not modern settler. I think we do have to make a distinction between capitalist settler and non-capitalist settler trends. They're both bad, but which is also different from just like people immigrating and joining other cultures, because that also happens all the time. Not ethno-nationalist. But the like looking at that trend, how it is interesting. I could see how that would have an appeal to indigenous people, in addition to the talk of like the validity of peasant forms of life, etc. And there are some ways in which like Marx's writing on peasants in France gets expanded to all agrarian labor forever and ever in ways that are weird. And people talking to me about peasants in the United States. I'm like, there are no peasants in the United like the closest thing we ever had to peasants was sharecroppers, and like there hasn't been sharecroppers in a long time.
Yeah, I think up here the appeal was more like just straightforward. It was the fact that Mao in China was not white. Well, it's not white. It wasn't like white Marxism. I think is part of it. But then also the fact that it wasn't strictly like workerist. Like maybe we don't have peasants in Canada, but I think it was more the concept that for Mao or Maoism, it wasn't just about the industrial working class. So it's like, even though we don't have peasants here, I think that was the appeal to the indigenous resistance movement, or part of the appeal for the indigenous resistance movement here was that it wasn't just about the urban industrial working class.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely understand that. I would also say, like, I kind of agree with InNotes on one thing, and that is, even when we say that our model for the worker was never the industrial worker as the only model for the worker, I have to admit, when I read Marx on lumpen and the letters on lumpenization and semi-lumpen and all those categories, I'm like, no, but yeah, he says it's not, and he definitely clearly says it's not in volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, but when he talks about it in political writings, it sure as hell sounds like he only means industrial workers. And like so I get where he clarifies it and says, no, that's not what I mean. Like, anybody, including, I think his example is teachers, if they work for a private school, are are part of the are part of productive labor.
Yeah.
Also, this is one thing that is weird in Maoism. Is the obsession that Maoists often have with productive labor as like a positive category of social distinction, as opposed to just like, no, but productive labor just means productive to capital surplus. Like that,
Right.
it doesn't
Like
mean
confuse the two things. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't mean good. It doesn't mean socially necessary. There are plenty of socially necessary things that are actually not productive labor.
Yeah.
Public school teaching, for example, is not productive labor. It survives off the social surplus.
Right.
But yeah, it's been kind of wild. But then I gotta admit, Mike, that watching Twitter get a hold of Marxology has made me wonder.
Made you wonder what the point is?
Yeah, well,
what the point of it all is?
It's just like when you start arguing, like Barista Gate was like my breaking moment because I was like, what? like, are you literally going to argue that service sector? Because if you're going to be consistent about this, service sector workers are not proletariat, which means you think one point of production magically bestows proletarian status.
There's a lot of category confusion, I think. And I can never tell if people are just doing it like they're trying to create controversy or if they actually believe what they're saying. It's kind of hard to tell, sometimes.
Yeah. Well, for me, to get all about social relations. I do think Twitter, in particular, even more than Facebook, encourages contrary takes, which is already bad enough because academia, as a former academic, also encourages contrary takes. Look at the history of post-Marxism and everything being based on like word equivocations that don't even make but what if value means something other? I'm like, no, but that Marx doesn't mean that. Like,
right, yeah.
Like, just use some basic logic here.
Like, people go in a very like esoteric direction with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the trend of non-activists in the 70s was to like, we're going to critique value by using other definitions. And I'm like, yeah, right. But those are different things. Just like the word represents multiple concepts, people.
Right. Yeah. That's part of the problem. Yeah. People just not understanding that a word can have more than one meaning or something, or wanting one word to mean everything. It's kind of, that aspect of the debate is kind of pointless. But I feel like it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's, certain mediums feed on that rather than more constructive discussion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also kind of clear when you interact with people that they haven't read it, and that's fine. I mean, look, I actually don't think everybody has the time to read everything. Like,
right, yeah.
But like, I'm just like, well, yeah, but if you don't read it, you don't have to comment. Like, you can still be involved in the larger Marxist movement without BSing us by quotes that you're taking out of context. You haven't actually read the text. Like, you could do other things.
That's part of the problem too. It encourages this thing where everyone feels like they have to have an opinion about everything, things that they don't know anything about. Whereas I don't really care about having an opinion about something. I'd rather actually try to learn something and even correct my former understanding of something. That would be great too,
Yeah. The mission of the show, I mean, honestly, I've talked a little bit about this, but the mission of the show is started out as, I have an educational mission. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to be entertaining, but I'm just like, this is what I think that I've read this week, that I can get the person to talk to me that I think is going to know enough about X. Sometimes they're academics. A lot of times they're just people that have actually, engaged with something, or they've been activists, or they've seen something. It's somewhere between scholarship and journalism, and it's not either, but increasingly it's also like, I don't understand this. I want someone to come on and explain it to me so that I can have a provisional opinion until someone else gives me the part of this that I didn't understand from the other person, so that I can eventually I can confuse myself into having a revolutionary theory by filling out holes in my education. Because everybody, even if you're like, actually, particularly if you're formally educated in Marxism, you're likely to be formally educated in a very narrow set of texts that was academically like accepted, or you got an academic-esque education from your sect that had a printing press in the 90s and aughts. usually Trotskyist, honestly. But that's kind of, it's actually has been interesting. What do you make of the rapid collapse of world Trotskyism? Like it seems to have collapsed overnight.
Yeah, it did seem to it did seem like it was really big, like in the early 2000s here in Vancouver and across Canada, and then it kind of collapsed. And there's still certain groups around, and there were certain in Canada, some of the main sort of like labor historians as well were like Trotskyists, or historians. They were like individuals. They were not necessarily part of a Trotskyist group, but they would write really interesting labor history or be involved in really like anti-poverty organizing or like more general like non-sectarian activism and social movements. And I remember I was never a Trotskyist, but I read his history of the Russian Revolution like 20 years ago or something, but I was kind of struck by it seemed kind of non-sectarian, like he was trying to be kind of objective and talk about all the different parties or factions that were involved in the revolution. I was kind of impressed by that. Like it seemed kind of non-sectarian to me, the way that he wrote that. But the way it turned out here in the 2000s, it became different Trotskyist groups were like really sectarian. And maybe that's partly why it kind of collapsed, is because they were really like the official Trotskyist groups are kind of rigid. They're not really able to like adapt to changing circumstances or something.
Right.
That might be part of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the fact that like Trotskyist groups split over things that like, and they remain split, but they're split over things that a lot of it when the Soviet Union fell in a way that none of them predicted. Yeah, some of them predicted the Soviet Union might fall, but none of them predicted the way it did. It's wild to watch like them double down on stuff like whether or not the Soviet Union is state capitalism, a deformed worker state, a bureaucratic collectivism.
Yeah. It's just like CLR James has like a joke about that in one of his books where he's like, what is it called? The deformed state, the really deformed worker state. Like he lists like the 10 different, terms that Trotskyists use for it. He's kind of making fun of them. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, it's I find that stuff hilarious. Well, it's been about an hour and a half, and I want to thank you for coming on. I'm going to put a link to both your kind of writer's webpage and the specific Briar Patch article that we referenced today, because I do think people should read it. And we didn't go into its exact argument, like kind of deliberately, actually, because again, I'd rather people actually read what we're talking about than have us digest it for them.
Right.
And hopefully for some people in the United States, I do have some Canadian, actually I have a fair amount of Canadian listeners.
Okay.
I was surprised. I was like, because I throw a lot of anti-Canada shade. But
we like that up here, though.
Yeah. I'm like, let's finish the War of 1812. And I'm like, yeah, you could tell I had Canadian relatives because Americans had no idea that war happened.
They don't even know what you're talking about. Yeah.
They're like, oh yeah, there's that time the British burned the White House and like something happened, and Andrew Jackson somehow came out of it. Have a nice day. Like that's
yeah, it's probably more of the part of the Canadian mythology than it is the American. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I remember learning about the Canadian mythology of the War of 1812 and being like, oh, well, I mean, I guess I'd be proud of that too. You did stop us from doing northern expansion first. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you. I appreciate you having me on, and
yeah. You mind if we tell the joke about how this happened? Because I thought.
Oh yeah, because you thought a meme was real. I was like, man, my memes are getting too realistic or something, I guess.
Yeah, I was like, oh, you want to come on and talk about this book? Because
and it's ironic because I mean I read that Chernyshevsky book a long time ago, and it was really influenced by it. And I was like, it's kind of ironic because I'm like, I think somebody should write that book. It'd be interesting. But it's just because I saw people sharing the Lenin rediscovered book that's on Haymarket. I'm not even sure who wrote that, but it was like a popular
Lars Lee wrote it. Who that's an interesting book, actually, in the sense that Lenin Rediscovered is respected by by non-Marxist Soviet scholars, even though Lars Lee is not a Soviet historian.
That's interesting.
Another kind of historian. I really like that book. I don't like his biography of Lenin because he skips the Civil War, and I find that suspicious.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just like, well, why do you jump over 1921 to 1925? That seems pretty big.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of, especially when Lenin's saying, a year, a week.
Yeah, I'm just
a year just happens in a week or something.
Yeah, yeah. But his book on Lenin Rediscovered, I think, is really good. But there's so many. Like, I keep on finding like early Soviet. I mean, we lost so much in the web purges. If anything, I will say this is one thing I have a hard time forgiving. Marxist-Leninists for. A lot of the stuff we can say about Stalin, if we're fair, like, no, the web purges were not like all Stalin. J. Arthur Geddes has made it pretty clear it was a broad social phenomenon set up by the system Stalin set up, but it's not, it wasn't like Stalin secretly masterminding at all. But the thing is, I'm like, we lost so many of the best Soviet scholars and thinkers, many of whom were perfectly proletarian in their origins, and with no evidence that they had any outside sympathies. I mean, I think one of the bigger ones is like Resnitsky, the person who was the head of the first MAGA project.
Was it like Ryzanov or something like that?
Ryzanov.
Yeah.
Who, was basically executed for insulting Stalin. That one really was that petty.
And that's a big loss, because I have his biography of Marx. I haven't fully read it yet, but yeah. But I imagine there's lots of stuff that's not translated into English from Russian either, yeah. Or maybe a lot of stuff got lost, probably.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that seems lost. I've been amazed at how much more Russian stuff we have than German stuff, even though there's more German speakers in America. I mean, I always make this joke, but it's a true joke. I can find 19th century Urdu poetry easier than I can find certain stuff from the Second International translated from German.
That's kind of strange, because there's lots of people of German ancestry in the States, yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, I can read German. I didn't even know this stuff existed. Like, so it's been interesting to see that. And I suspect there's a lot of Soviet stuff that if it doesn't fit into one of the two Cold War narratives, we just don't have it. Right, like if it doesn't make Stalin look really, really bad, because there has been kind of a favoring of left opposition stuff to be translated into English because it was part of the Cold War. It's like, let's find the communists too.
Oh, right.
But there's a lot of stuff from the left opposition, like Pannekoek, for example. There's a whole lot of Pannekoek that we do not have in English, which is wild to me. Jan Appel, we have some of his stuff, not some of the stuff we have to thank for the fact that like Paul Maddock kept it around, or like with Grossman, even though it was published in the U.S., it was published in German. It was translated by an Indian Trotskyist in the 70s, Jairus Banerjee. And it's just like, like what? Like,
and then also there's like Rosa Luxemburg's, like, she wrote a book about political economy, and part of it's, some of it didn't survive. They say they lost the chapter on value or something, which is another kind of tragedy. But her stuff is actually really good. It's just nobody takes the time to read it, actually.
Yeah, they only
just kind of they kind of just use her as like a figurehead or something, but they don't actually read her actual writing. Yeah. And it's actually really, really good if you get into it. Yeah.
In the sectarian zine wars of the aughts and 90s, Rosa Luxemburg is invoked a lot and read very little.
Yeah.
And people do read. I think people read Reform and Revolution, but they don't know how much other work she did. I mean, she had all these ethnographic notebooks that are fascinating. Right. She was one of the first. It's interesting because she opposed the national question, but she was, but she actually was one of the only people studying different indigenous groups in the Americas and Africa and trying to incorporate them more fully into Marxist conceptions of development and where they might fit in and what we could learn from them. I mean, Marx and Engels did that too, but like they didn't have the resources to do it on that scale, honestly.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. People just focus on one aspect of her writing and not other aspects of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, she had kind of a unique take on those things too, and her take on imperialism and everything too. Like, her takes are kind of unique compared to other Marxists. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as my last thought, as we kind of wrap this up, I will say that I've been fascinated now by actually mapping out the different theories of imperialism, because I realize we have like 10 of them, but we throw the word around so much that we don't know which one we're referring to when. Like,
yeah.
So.
And people talk about as if like Lenin invented the concept, but they don't really talk about that there was this whole background of other thinkers writing about it that he was influenced by, or even like James Connolly in Ireland and stuff. Like he had a really short article on imperialism and war, but it's basically the same thesis that Lenin had, a decade later or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, Lenin's piece is actually like trying to reconcile like Hobson with Bukharin and like one coherent theory, and other people had kind of already convergently weirdly done that, but Lenin didn't have access to it. Right. There's, the imperialism debates in the Second International are fascinating. I mean, Kautsky's interesting because on some things he's very right, but like on colonialism, he's pretty bad. Like it's kind of wild to read. You just realize that like, oh, we've lost because of the Cold War. I mean, and it's not, and this is not just from the States end of the thing either. We've lost a lot of those of the memory of those debates, and so like we don't realize that like some of these theories of imperialism don't really agree with each other, or like so like when I ask people, okay, when we're not talking about colonial imperialism and we're talking about like fiscal imperialism, what elements of it are we focusing on? Because like for example, if you're going to decide if China is acting imperialistically, it actually depends on which model you're using, because one of them they are and another one they're not. And I can go into that. So in one model, they are using external sources to get rid of overproduction and to outsource some of their labor, and they're not necessarily skilling up people in that area to do so. And that is one of the models of imperialism. That's not the same model as actually what Lenin was talking about, and it's definitely not like gunboat diplomacy imperialism. That's completely different. So like, what do we mean? And I realize that we can't magically make words all clear. I'm not one of those weird, I mean, like I flirt with logical positivism sometimes, but I'm not one. But I do kind of think we do have to go like, okay, what definition are you actually operating under here? Because a lot of times we're talking past each other. And again, just to get in why I care about Marxology is that when you deal with Marxology, that becomes clear really quick. It's like, we don't mean the same thing by this word.
People need to define their terms before they have a discussion, because otherwise, they'll just be talking past each other. That's definitely with both of those things. I'd say imperialism and Marxology. Those are both two good examples of that, of people just talking past each other.
Yeah, I think nationalism, as we talked about earlier, is another one, because if you think, if you think indigenous people want an exclusive ethno state a la Central Europe in the middle 20th century, I would oppose that too.
It's like,
so would a lot of indigenous people.
It's like a misconception, or using some things don't translate into English too, right? Like some of our concepts for land or for a nation, the English words don't really work. They don't really describe what our concepts are, but we have to use, that's all we have to communicate with people that has to speak English. So
maybe as the true last note, I was sitting when I told you about this off air. I'm pretty fairly close friends with Moroni Brunelli, who's kind of a scholar and advocate for the Dine Nation. And we were sitting down and like trying to deal with all these Dine concepts. There really is like any English word will get to part of it, but it has other baggage that it doesn't have in Navajo. And like I was like, I can find better translations for some of these words in like ancient Greek than I can in modern English. It's and even that's not exact, but like at least you get some kind of parallel here, and there is like some European concept that you could kind of tie it to, but it's not in English at all, like particularly in modern English. So it's
you'd have to construct the whole sentence or paragraph to explain like a certain words or certain concepts in Cree or in other indigenous languages. You'd have to put some work into. You can just directly translate it. You'd have to make something new.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to use the same kind of, religious texts are the only texts that generally get that kind of like careful scrutiny. I guess Marxism, because we're kind of sometimes a religion too, really.
Get religious about the meaning of Aufheben. Get really spiritual about it.
Yeah, we get real eschatological, and we definitely develop sectarian organization. But but no, when people argue with Marxism as science or religion, I'm like, it's a scientific other. It is not a science, though. I mean, Marx may have thought that, but like, but yeah, like, it's the science of revolution. Yeah, well, I don't know what that is, man.
People just like the word science, I think.
Yeah,
they don't really care what it means.
It's a weird 19th century. Well, I mean, honestly, as a person who's like, my interest in philosophy is actually, before I got into this Marxist stuff, is actually philosophy of science.
All right.
And so, like, I actually realized it's really fucking hard to define science. Like, so I get why like it's an issue and can be abused, because I'm like, I actually can't always tell you what a science is either, and I think a lot about it.
There's more than one aspect to it.
There's anytime you try to pin down like the demarcation question, like the singular thing that makes something a science, is it Baconian methodology? Is it like falsification? You end up with like, nope. There's always one field. It's usually either evolutionary science or quantum physics or something that like doesn't fit, and you're just like, shit, that is a science. I don't know. Anything involving math actually becomes a problem, because you got probability, and you can't truly falsify anything probabilistically. It's just like I don't have a good answer for this question. Words are hard, man. What I got. Anyway, it's been delightful having you on, and hopefully this will lead people into checking out your work. And actually, I think between that and some of the news out of Canada in the last year, people are beginning to take Canadian Indigenous and Metis issues more seriously. But we'll see. We'll see if it sticks.
Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yep. Have a great evening.
You too.